Welcome back to Dead Good Book Reviews. I'm Judith and you're watching another episode of Overbooked here on the channel. This is the series where I talk about every single book on my shelves because I think it might unlock new or very old magics. Today we are talking about Alexander Dan Wilhelmsen's The Hjemland Saga? Shadows of the Short Days and The Storm Beneath a Midnight Sun. Some quick disclaimers before we start. I did have review copies of both of these books. This I had originally a digital review copy. This copy I think is actually Justine's that I took from her, possibly. I can't remember, regardless of where books come from. Nobody's paying me to talk about books, and Justine is a very good egg. I'm going to keep this as spoiler-free as humanly possible for both books, so if you do want to go in knowing absolutely nothing, click away now. I'll also link the story graph for the books below in case you want to check out any user-generated content warnings, which I would definitely recommend doing, particularly for the second book. Looking up the genre of these books was really interesting. I got fantasy, dystopian, urban, absurdist, and political, which I don't know if I would describe it as absurdist, but there we go. The first book came out in 2019, and the second book, which the cover is right here, came out in 2022. Or possibly 2023, depending on whether it was a typo on NetGalley or not. I had the review copy in 2023, which might be for the paperback edition. It's confusing and complicated, and I don't want to look it up. Alexander Dan Wilhelmsen is an Icelandic author who writes in both Icelandic and English. Thank you, Angela, for your comment on a previous video of mine. I believe these were originally written in English and translated into Icelandic. I don't speak Icelandic, so forgive some of my pronunciation in this video. Let me give you the blurb of book one. A sorcerer, an outcast, a city, a revolution. Seymundr has been expelled from the magical university for ignoring the rules. Garun is a half-human, half-Huldufolk on a one-outcast graffiti war against her city. Between them, they're on the verge of making a difference. Garun is determined to make Reykjavik a city where everyone belongs, even if she must oust those in charge to do it. Seymundr is hell-bent on mastering every forbidden mystery of Galdor, even if he destroys the city in the process. One thing is for sure, when his unstoppable curiosity meets her immovable resolution, Reykjavik itself will change. So the first book is set in this kind of alternate Reykjavik, where we have a very much a city-based fantasy, revolution-focused, magic is happening. The second book, which I'm not going to keep putting cover up on screen, but I'm just going to gesture in this direction like it's floating off screen a little bit, is set more in the rural area of Iceland. We definitely go away from the city, but we are dealing with the consequences of book one, with different characters. I have complicated feelings about this series. I've read both of them. They are both quite long. Book one is about 600 pages. I think book two is about the same. And I have feelings. First up, we're going to start with what I like about this series, because that's the structure of these videos. I really like the world of this series. I really like this alternate Reykjavik. I think it's really interesting. I feel like with Icelandic fantasy or that kind of area of the world fantasy, you usually get something very specific and very rural fantasy almost, and to have urban fantasy in that sense was really interesting. I loved Garun's graffiti warfare. I thought that was so interesting, and you definitely get a sense of a book being written by someone who lives in a place, or lives in that specific place. I mean, everyone lives in a place. Combining that modern day aesthetic almost with that ancient folklore and ideology and such makes for a really fresh, interesting book that doesn't feel like anything else I'd read. Maybe that's because I've not read a lot of Icelandic urban fantasy, but I don't know how many people have read a lot of that, so I feel like it would still feel fresh to other people. It does manage to balance, particularly I think in book two, the modern and the historical at the same time. You have magical technology, you have just technology straight on its own, and also this really big sense of beings that have lasted longer than humanity has. This idea of a world steeped in history, which I think works really well. One of my favourite things in urban fantasy is getting a sense of the history of a place. You're not just touching the modern day, you're touching everything moving backwards, especially when we're dealing with fantasy creatures that live longer than a mortal lifespan or live a different lifespan to a mortal. I just found it very interesting. I like the way that he balances those two things. Again, particularly book two has some really interesting magical technology stuff going on, and also magical industry. I think if you like the kind of creep factor, these might be books for you. They're not horror books. I don't think I would describe them as that way, but they do have body horror elements to them. Again, particularly book two, but there are some really nasty bits of book one. I'm a person who is easily squicked out by things, and I coped. So if you're a hardened body horror reader, you might find this a bit tame. Those scenes were written really well, those moments were written in a really interesting way, and definitely book two, the tension of that really crept up on me, and there's some really sort of society horror, body horror, just general creepiness going on in this series. So I think it might make a good October-y Halloween book if you were looking for something to fill a gap in your TBR then. Right, now on to the reasons why I wouldn't necessarily recommend this, especially not to everyone as like a blanket recommendation. I think these are quite hard to digest. They took me a long while to get through. I definitely found that Shadows of the Short Days was easier on a reread because I knew where it was going, so I could keep a better handle on what was happening. Storm Beneath the Midnight Sun took me, I think, a couple of weeks to actually finish, and it was tough going. I think part of that's because there's a lot of Icelandic words thrown into the narrative. You saw that in the blurb. There's a lot of things thrown in that don't get explained because the characters already know what they are. There is a glossary at the back of book 1. I don't know if there is in book 2. There wasn't in my review copy, and that's helpful, but also it's right at the end, so you have to know it's there to flip to it, and the first time I read it, I didn't know it was there, so I didn't, and I got very confused. And I think if you're a person who, like me, if your brain starts skipping over words, you can get a little bit lost. That was what started to happen. I think they're a little bit dense, a little bit hard to get into, and also probably, in my opinion, a little bit too long, both of them. I would cut them down slightly. I think you could make a tighter story. There's a lot of bump to them. In both books, there are these multiple perspectives. You kind of follow either two characters or two groups of individuals telling two stories that run parallel to one another. So in the first book, we have Garun and Seymundur. And in both instances, I liked one character more than the other, which was annoying because then you feel every time you're going to that character that you don't really like as much. You're like, I just wish I was back with Garun. I just want to hear about graffiti warfare again. But I think what's interesting is that in both instances, those characters that I liked became non-likable. And I think that was intentional. I don't think that was, I accidentally made my character unlikable. I think that was something he was trying to do. But it meant that you were just left with no likable characters and everything just felt a little bit bleak. And I wanted to be able to continue rooting for someone, and I wasn't really rooting for anyone by the time I got to the end of book 2. I was rooting broadly for the world, but not through the eyes of these characters. So it's interesting. Possibly if you're someone who needs to be less connected to the characters, you might enjoy this more. For me personally, I just ended up being like, no, you're all letting me down. Everyone here is disappointing me. And lastly, obviously, if you're not wanting that ick factor, that body horror, there's an element of a pregnancy plotline in book 2 that I think some people might not enjoy. I personally found it a little bit much for me. Possibly this might not be a series for you. Check out those content warnings, see how you feel about it. Other things you might want to read, or other things I could compare this to, I've not read a lot of urban fantasy, and I don't read a lot of fantasy set in the real world, so it's hard for me to define. The only book that came up when I was thinking about Icelandic books is All the Horses of Iceland, but I've not read that, so I can't actually recommend it to you. I do know people who have enjoyed it. I'm trying to think, what's a book that I read that's set in the real world? Why can't my brain supply me with information when I need it? I'm very much a person who lives in just everywhere else. Because when I think city-based fantasy that has a little bit of technology or is set in an interesting time period, I think the Greenbone Saga. But that's not very similar to this series. I don't know what to tell you. I keep knocking all of my sewing patterns, I'm sorry. The other book that I've read recently that had this kind of same ocean-based body horror stuff is actually a children's book, so it's very different in its tone, but Deep Light by Frances Harding had some of those elements that I found in book 2. I think I could compare the two a little bit easily. There's neurons connecting where the two of those meet in my little brain. Should you read these? Rare answer, I don't think they are the most worth reading books. I hung on to Shadows of the Short Days because I knew I wanted to reread it to see how I felt about it. And I think if I had the time to read both books in this series about 5 times, I would probably end up really liking them. And that's a really interesting thing to say, because obviously I'm not going to do that. I don't have the time. I don't have the energy. I don't have the willpower. But I can see a world where when I finally wrapped my head around these books, I really enjoyed them. So perhaps if you're a person who really wants to do that, it might be a read for you. I think for the majority of us, they're just a little bit too dense. They're just a little bit inaccessible. And that doesn't mean that they're not good. That doesn't mean there's not good elements to them. I just don't think they're worth the investment of time you have to put in to understand the books fully. And I think, probably be unhauling Shadows of the Short Days for now. Probably. Have you read this? Do you have plans to? Do you have any place-based fiction that you really enjoy? Please do let me know down in the comments below. While you're down there commenting, if you haven't already, please do subscribe. It makes me feel loved and appreciated. You can also follow me on social media. Come hang out on Discord where we have chill chats about books. I'd like to say an enormous, huge, squishy thank you to all the ghosts who haunt me over on Patreon. They support the channel and in return get early access to videos, bonus content, live streams, and more. If you'd like to join their number, that's linked below as well. Thank you so much for watching. That's all from me, and I will see you in the next one. There's gonna be some bloopers now. Looking up the genre of these, but for me, I found it really evocative. I think these are